So hi everybody, we're going to get going. It's 8:30 and we've only got half an hour, so we want to make sure we make full use of our time today. My name's Neill Duffy. I am Chief Executive of a company that we describe as the world's first sports impact company, operating at the intersection of sport, business and purpose. It's called 17 Sport. And today is a special day for us because it's the first of our new webinar series, Purposefull Stories, which we decided to do to try and amplify some of the great stories from the front lines of purpose and sport. And very excited to start with a bang today. With us is Sebastian Buck. Hi, Sebastian.
Oh, good morning.
There you go. Sebastian is one of those people that I have huge admiration for. He's a real thought leader, and I always enjoy our conversations. They're always thought-provoking and go down places I didn't expect them to go. So Sebastian is one of the founders and strategic lead at Enso, an impact agency, but not focused on sport. Works with some great brands, and a very passionate sports person. He'll be the first to tell you that sport's not his profession. We know that, although he is an avid cyclist, but someone who has lots of views on sport. And then also with us today is Andrew Wisniewski. Andrew is a senior account manager at 17 Sport. Andrew's going to moderate the Q&As today, so he'll pop in and out of the conversation with questions. If you have any questions, post them on the chat bar, and Andrew will collate those and jump in as a Zoom bomber every now and again to ask us questions. So the topic for today is all around how does sport reboot post-COVID. It's been really encouraging to see the way that sport has stepped up and responded to the crisis. There have been various different forms of response, from traditional ones, auctions, that type of stuff. Some innovative examples like the Mercedes-Benz Formula One team designing ventilators and filling a gap on that front. Some organizations that have pivoted, like AB InBev with their Budweiser brand, who repurposed their sponsorship spend to support people on the front line of fighting the COVID virus. So that was pretty cool. And then there have also been a lot of examples of sport playing a caretaker role or caregiver role, using sport as a platform to help people in tough times and tough situations. So lots of great examples of sport doing good. So thank you to everybody out there in the world of sport that's been playing their part in a very difficult situation. But Sebastian, I have a sense that it's also been quite an interesting time in terms of that what's happened has really exposed some sort of fundamental fault lines in sport as a business model. And I know that that's something that you've also noticed. I mean, we've actually spoken about it before this month, but this last month where sport is basically shut down overnight. I mean, Adam Silver made that announcement that the NBA would be postponing its season, and literally within days, the whole of sport around the world had closed down. And it's really exposed some shortcomings, hasn't it?
It has, and I think it's exposed obviously some very practical things about the business model, stadiums, and the ability to create the entertainment products that it creates. But what I'm interested in, what I focus on, and what we focus on at Enso is how can organizations really create value for the world, can create broader impact in the world beyond the product that they create. And I felt for a long time that sport under-delivers on that front, that it under-realizes the value that it could create for the world. I think, what we're seeing right now is a lot of conversation about sports that focuses on the economics, the practicalities of the delays, and the absence of their entertainment product. But I think it's sad in a way at a time of, elevated need for togetherness, elevated need for coming together as communities, taking on some very significant challenges together, that sport hasn't played a bigger role in that effort. And I think that stems from a lack of investment that sports has made in true community building. I think sports has, from my perspective, got very comfortable with its business model of entertainment, which has been a pretty stable business, pretty straightforward business. And has not really thought about how are organizations and brands evolving, how are great brands getting built, which I think today is, centered around what's the value that you're bringing to the world, and how do you bring people together around that? How do you invest people as participants, not just as consumers? And I don't think the world of sports has done a great job of that. And now we're seeing, the I think complete halt of sports, when if they had built it in a great way, I think sports could be playing a much more important role in culture right now.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, I know that you and I have discussed this before, a book written by James Case back in 1986, which talks about two different types of games, the infinite game and the finite game. And it's a great book. I encourage you all to read it because it really explains how the world works, if you think about it. And really talks to this issue of, I guess, mindset and short-termism versus long-termism, if there are such words as those two. But this kind of focus around why you exist in business. And what I really love about that model is, James talks about, and those that play an infinite game play for the long run. There are no winners or losers. People that think like that talk about just causes. So he talks about just causes, and Simon Sinek's also picked up on this a lot. I think for me, just to build on what you said, I think one of the challenges, or one of the reasons that sports finds itself in this underperforming situation right now, is that, let's face it, they don't really have a just cause. I mean, I think for most of sports, it's just causes to make money. And that's just not what the world needs or is looking for right now, even pre-COVID, is it?
Yeah, I think that's right. What's intriguing to me, and I was really glad when you told me about that book. I've gone and looked at it, and there is this really interesting challenge between a focus on presence in the here and now, and the focus on the bigger picture in the longer term. It's a cliche in sports. When you hear sports people interviewed, they always talk about, we're just focused on the next game, on the next game. If you take that too far, then it means you don't really stand for a long-term, bigger vision in the world. Like, what's the 100-year vision? What's the generationally important mission that you're pursuing? And it does seem like that's played out in most of the sports brands, most of the sports franchises you can see. I wish the Olympics meant more to me, more to humanity than it does. The predominant way that it hits me, that it reaches me, is as a vehicle for entertainment and sponsorship. It definitely looks like it's oriented around maximizing sponsorship revenues and maximizing TV viewership, and doesn't appear to me, at least, to have invested nearly what it could have done in actually mobilizing generations around sports, inspiring people around togetherness, rebuilding belonging in communities, etc. So yeah, it does seem like sports has been focused on short-term and sort of very finite definitions of success, particularly around financial returns, which is a shame.
So it's funny that you bring up the Olympic movement, because the IOC's purpose, they talk about their purpose to be to build a better world through sport. So I think the IOC is trying to, I think of all the sports properties out there, the IOC has probably been one of the first to recognize that it has this role to play in society, which goes back to the values of Olympism and that type of stuff. Just starting to get into their stride from an execution point of view. So hopefully we'll start to see that shift and change over time. But it's interesting that that's what you take out right now, and that's, so that if that's what you're hearing and that's what you're receiving, that's what's being put out. So, and I would consider the IOC to be one of the kind of more forefront thinkers in the space. So if that's even not working, it just reinforces the challenges that sport has.
Yeah, and I brought them up almost because I hold the Olympics to a higher bar, right? I think the Olympian ideal should always have been, is always one that transcends the narrow definition of winning, but is more of a sort of humanitarian perspective on the world. That said, I feel like even the sports franchises that exist in cities should be considering the bigger game. What is the bigger game beyond just winning the trophy and maximizing financial return? If you think about the 1950s, there was a deficit of entertainment and actually pretty high levels of belonging in communities, centered around faith groups and community organizations, what have you. If you fast forward to now, I think we're almost in the inverse. We've got a plethora of entertainment and a deficit of belonging. And it doesn't seem to me that sports organizations have stepped into that evolving need that people have. I would love to see a world where, for instance, I live in LA. I wish the Dodgers played a role as the preeminent organization bringing Angelenos together. Yes, around sports, but also around other things. I would love to see a world where the Dodgers are fostering games in every community, that they are, supporting block parties and supporting the school teams, and they do some of those activities in a very sort of tangential way, an arm's length, some dollars put into foundation activities. It's not seen as a core part of the organization, and so it's underinvested in. And I'm picking on them, but I think that's true of most organizations.
And that's a key point, I think, Sebastian. So sport does do good. I mean, nobody denies that, and we all recognize the good that sport does through their foundations, through their community relations departments. But I think the truth is that it's always, in 99 times out of 100, it's on the periphery of the business as opposed to sitting at the heart of why that organization exists. And that's a great segue to the next thing I wanted to go to, which was the kind of model of capitalism that is evolving in the world. So we've started to see that in the business sector has been very quick to recognize that people's expectations are changing. People expect organizations to stand for something more than just profits. They want them to have a just cause, to be responsible. And as a result of that, more and more of them are embracing purpose as a core organizing principle for their businesses. We're seeing sport being slow to kind of catch up with or to jump on that realization. But I'm wondering if one of the positive things to come out of COVID is that we might see a change now. So Mark Cuban, however you want to pronounce his name, Dallas Mavericks entrepreneur, Shark Tank, kind of poster boy for capitalism, was interviewed on CNBC last week, and he said, just want to get the quote right here, is that capitalism will become more compassionate as a result of COVID. It can't just be about the shareholders. So for me, that's quite significant that somebody like Mark Cuban, who's very respected as an owner of a great sports team, great sports franchise, I think maybe even the most valuable sports franchise in the USA, that he's starting to talk like this. So other businesses are pivoting to this change, and sport hasn't done it yet. I mean, why do you think that is? Where do you think this is heading?
That's a great question. I go back to the point I made about the business model has been relatively easy, right? TV fees have been going up and up. And so sport, from my perspective, has been in a classic kind of innovator's dilemma of, do you actually invest in what's next, or do you just continue to focus on what you're doing today? And it seems like most sports organizations focused on that. I do think that shift in capitalism you're talking about is gathering pace. And I think it's partly gathering pace, not just because of the scale of the challenges is escalating, not just because consumers are demanding it, but increasingly it's because people inside the organizations are demanding it. So the best talent, the best employees are starting to demand that their organization takes a lead. And I think you're starting to see that in sports too. You're starting to see some athletes take stands that previously sports organizations have been very scared to take. I think another example of it is Arthur Blank and some of the investments they've made in community. I think the LAFC has done an amazing job of investing in community, not as a philanthropic initiative, but as a core business activity of building support and building a culture around a new sports franchise. I also think Phil Knight at Nike, the way he led that organization from just winning and selling shoes to a bigger sense of serving the world is another example.
Yeah. Andrew, before we come to you, I just want to build on the Phil Knight thing a little bit. I mean, another great example of a brand that's kind of built that close relationship with the community in sport is Nike. And I thought their response around the COVID thing was kind of spot on. It demonstrated a deep understanding of the issues, a deep understanding of the role that they should play. What was your take on how they handled the whole thing?
Yeah, I think Nike has a history of really understanding culture. I think they listen hard, and I think they are very clear on the values that they stand for. And that, I think, is an exercise in, like, organizations need to stop and really center on, like, what are they about? If they've done that exercise, then they can have the confidence to take bold stands. Most organizations would have killed, for instance, their support of Colin Kaepernick out of fear. But Nike's done the work to understand what they're about and what the people that support them believe in. And so it gives them the confidence to really be a leader, as opposed to, letting the fear of sort of being above the fray or out of the fray win over. And so I think that kind of leadership brand is needed, particularly in this moment when a lot of culture is up for review. A lot of the assumptions that we've all held about how the world works is up for review. And I think we have to look at some of the major organizations in the world, particularly the big companies, and particularly the organizations that can control attention, like the sports franchises, as needing to play that leadership role in the next phase of the world. And to do that, they need to have got really, really clear on what they're about, what they believe in, what they will stand behind, and then commit to that wholeheartedly.
So what was interesting about the Nike response was, despite the fact that, in theory, people no longer need their products because they're stuck at home, they were still able to lean into the situation and be useful and helpful and put out their arms around their community and say, hey, we recognize this is a tough time, but you can actually become part of this bigger team playing for everybody by staying at home and doing the responsible thing. And so that was a great insight around how all your communication and what you do doesn't need to be built around your product. It can be around something. Right. And that
around shared belief.
Exactly. Right. The product just becomes the enabler, but the just cause or the shared belief is what is the raison d'etre, is what really matters at the end of the day. Yeah. Andrew.
Yeah, sorry to jump in and interrupt. We're just getting a lot of good questions. Some that y'all are already naturally answering, but there's two that I wanted to bring to the forefront. The first is this idea of sport coalescing around a single purpose versus, sustainability or community, versus, specific local purposes within their communities. And in that same vein, it's kind of around language and this idea of purpose, and what does the word purpose mean in the sport of context and society, and how can we maybe refresh that and take a different look at it?
Sebastian, you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, so purpose and then single or multiple. Purpose, I think, has become quite a zeitgeisty phrase. And honestly, we at Enso try to move beyond purpose, because purpose typically is stated intention. And what we're more interested in is what's the end impact? What comes after purpose, when purpose is realized? That said, I also, like Neill, like the clarification of a just cause. And the reason I like that is it's a long-term mission. At Enso, we talk a lot about shared missions. Like, how is this something that others can be invested in for the long term? So, purpose is important, but I think is a stepping stone to impact. And I do think a lot of organizations need to spend more time getting clear on what it is that ultimate success looks like for them beyond just trophies and dollars. In terms of single or multiple, I think it's hard to say that any industry should have a single purpose. I think that purpose has to come from the truth of the organization, the people inside the organization, the people that they serve, from their communities, from their supporters, their fans, their players, etc. And so it's probably more realistic to say sports organizations should find their own purpose. That said, I would go back to what I said about belonging. I do think there is a crisis of social isolation in the world. There is a crisis of polarization. Those things, those forces are getting amplified, particularly as we are all socially isolated. And the world urgently needs more togetherness, needs vehicles for finding common ground. I think the kind of shared experiences that the sports industry overall creates are exactly what the world needs to find more commonality. And so if the entire industry could center around one, that would be it for me. Could the sports industry commit to investing in the kinds of community building that would grow business, but would also create massive positive social impact in the world? But Neill, I'm interested in your answer.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if it's naive to think that the whole sports industry can coalesce around one thing. I agree that would be amazing if it happened. I just wonder whether that's a bridge too far right now. But I agree with you, this concept of togetherness is something that naturally fits with sport, and it's something that we desperately need right now. I'd kind of add to what Sebastian has said by saying that I think at an individual franchise team level, I think it's really important that purpose is about having an intention to do more good than harm. Does that make sense? And I think the more specific you can be about what that good is, the better, because it helps you to focus on what you're going to spend your time, effort, and resources on. And again, if we draw on some great examples from mainstream business, I mean, I love Tesla's positioning around, accelerating the planet's transition to a sustainable future. It's kind of very clear what they're doing. Or someone like REI, who are all about celebrating the outdoors, getting everybody to love the outdoors. They feel, to me, those are good examples, as opposed to, I just looked up the NFL's vision, I think it's their mission statement. They don't actually have a purpose statement. But they say, we're all stewards of football. We unite people and inspire communities in the joy of the game by delivering the world's most exciting sports and entertainment experience. So it's quite a mouthful, one, to try and understand that. But it's about, they talk about uniting people and inspiring communities. Well, question mark, are they doing that? How could they do that better? I mean, I think the NFL have made huge strides in the last 24 months around this space. Their Inspire Change program is great, starting to get to some of the types of things that we're talking about. But yeah, so in summary, I would say that you've got to have the right intention, and I think it does serve sports well to understand where it wants to make a difference. The SDGs are a great framework, the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 different goals. Sport can rally around the individual goals that mean most to them. What's relevant for a sailing event is different to what's relevant for a basketball event. So I'm waffling. Andrew, what else you got?
So we only have 5 minutes, and apologies for everyone whose question we're not getting to, but another two questions for y'all to finish out the session with. The first is around what role athletes play, as activists, people like the U.S. Women's National Team or Colin Kaepernick, and kind of what role they play in this and that. And then the second one was, we've gotten a few questions about esports, and obviously we've seen a lot of esports organizations really step up during this time. So, what role do they have to play in the future of reshaping the sports as we know it?
So why don't you take the first one, Sebastian, and I'll take the esports one.
Okay. I think it's very exciting that a lot of significant athletes are taking big stands. I think it's very sad that the industry often has resisted that. If you think about the U.S. Women's National Team, that's that's not been an easy path for those players advocating for equal pay. If you think about, you know, Kaepernick being ostracized, that's not a glorious situation for the NFL. It's not showing them in a good light, and I think that comes down to you know, an attachment to quite historic norms of brands, and not engaging in potentially divisive issues. I think that's the 20th century or even early 20th century business and marketing playbook, and I don't think is relevant for now. So I hope that more and more athletes actually step into their role as advocates, but even more than that, as actually drivers of impact. You know, I think Common Goal is one example, and Juan Mata, and what he's actually led as a systemic change in the industry, mobilizing, I think it's over 100 athletes now to commit 1% of their salaries to a common fund. That for me is an example of systemic change that an athlete is leading, even beyond just adding their voice. So that trend for me hopefully will continue and will compel the industry to change as those leaders have louder and louder voices.
Yeah, I'd echo all of that. And as far as the esports piece is concerned, I mean, it's phenomenal to think that esports didn't even exist, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago. And it's just exploded. And I guess the reason for that is that they're filling a need. They're delivering entertainment in a different way around sport. But I'm not sure that it's the solution, to be honest. I mean, everybody's now starting an e-competition of some kind. So we have Formula One drivers trying to race each other in a virtual environment on some e-gaming platform. And so I think it's just more of the same. I think it's just perpetuating the same fundamental design shortcomings in sport. It's just that esports provides a different way of delivering, a similar product, but it doesn't get to the root cause maybe not the cause, but the root opportunity that sport has to redefine itself and make itself fit for purpose in the age of social good. I think what happens if, that's a stupid example, but what happens if suddenly there's no electricity and you can't do your e-gaming anymore? Then the whole esports industry would fall in a hole, just like sports fallen in a hole right now. And so I think that just as we kind of close out now, I think the interesting thing around all of this is really coming back to what we started the conversation around, which is what is sports just cause, whether that's traditional sport or esports. What's its cause? How does it make the world a better place? How does that drive the organization of the business in such a way that it can survive these types of catastrophic events that we've had? Because it has a really essential role to play. I mean, we'd want sport to be categorized as an essential service, which it isn't at the moment, which is why it's all shut down. And so what do we need to do for sport to become an essential service in our society and in our world? And I think if we could find a way to put purpose or just cause at the center of the organization so that we carried on irrespective of whether there was electricity or people were able to come to the stadiums, or sport still existed because of the stuff that Sebastian spoke about, of this building community, building togetherness, being useful. I mean, Sebastian, I love that example you shared with me the other day of the NHS in the UK, who put out a call for volunteers to help store up the system. They were expecting to get 250,000 responses, and they got 750,000 responses. Wouldn't it be cool if one of the sports franchises, or all of them, had put out a request to their fans and said, guys, we need you to come together now to help out in this tough time? That would be sport playing a really useful role. So that's what I wish for. I hope that COVID forces sport to reevaluate its role in society, the way that it does business, its business model. We still want sport. Sport always has to deliver a great product. That's not negotiable. Nobody wants to be part of something that doesn't perform at the highest level. But maybe we can just find a different reason for existing that repositions us as an essential service in the future. Sebastian, last word from you before we wrap up. My
last word would be two things. One is, I wish sports organizations have done the work such that they were able to play a bigger role in this kind of crisis. An illustration of that would be Barcelona has 170,000 members. It's one of the more enlightened organizations, foster more participation than others. I would have loved to see some organizations like that put out the call to their members to actually play a role, a constructive role, helping the city of Barcelona through its crisis. Hopefully the next time humanity faces a challenge, sports will have done the work such that it's built deep community relationships such that it can play that kind of role. And then the last point I would make is, this is not just from a philanthropic perspective, although I think there's a strong reason to step into this kind of work for a philanthropic motivation. But if you think about the delta between the kinds of financial returns that sports organizations make relative to, for instance, Disney. Disney makes $11 billion of profit from their parks and experiences alone. That is so far in excess of any sports organization anywhere. To a factor of like 10 or 50 or even 100 times any sports organization. And I think the world of sports should look at this form of community building and adding value to the world, adding value to people, not just from an altruism perspective, but as a path to much, 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 much better business and financial return for stakeholders as well.
Great. Thank you, Sebastian. So thank you all for listening. Just some housekeeping before we wrap up. Our next webinar is Tuesday, the 24th of April at 9 o'clock Pacific time, 9 a.m. Pacific time. Really excited. We're going to have Todd Jacobson, who heads up NBA Cares, to talk about the NBA Together program, which has been one of the few examples of a league coming together, or a team coming together to try and activate in support of its community. The title, How the NBA Put the Community Center Court During COVID-19. So join us for that. That should be great. And then in terms of follow-up to today, we'll be sending you all an email with a link to a new Slack channel that we're starting called Sport 2.0. And what we want to try and do is encourage you to join that Slack channel so that we can get a conversation going amongst us all beyond the webinar. So join the Slack channel. Be a great opportunity for people to meet each other and to engage with each other and to fuel this conversation. And Andrew, I think you're putting up that URL link on the chat board as well, in case anybody wants to access it there, as well as the invite to register for the next webinar on the 24th of April. Sebastian, thank you once again. You've been a star as always.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for listening. Please stay safe, stay well, and stay positive. Remember, we will come out of this, and I think it's going to be an exciting opportunity for all of us to come out of it stronger, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.